Hey, welcome everybody to
Broadcast is live.
yeah, we are live now. Welcome everybody. I'm super excited to have here April Dunford, author of Obviously Awesome, and this is going to be a fun chat about positioning and everything else. April, how are things with you this afternoon?
Things are great. Things are great. It's good to be here.
Yeah, I mean, before we get started around this, I'd just love to get to know you. Like, what has been, and I'm throwing this out there and putting you on the spot. What's been your pandemic hobby? Like this lockdown, did you pick up any kind of hobby? Did you like
Oh
pick up
man.
baking or something else? I'd love to just hear what you've been up to.
Yeah, like what like I have teenagers and they took up bread making and stuff, and that was great because I got to eat the bread without actually making the bread. So that was awesome. But no, you know what? My pandemic has been work filled. Like I just doubled down on consulting projects, and I've done so much cool work in the last year and a bit. It's been amazing. But it's been a little intense because I feel like I haven't really done anything except work for like a year and a bit, almost to the exclusion of anything else. Like it's a bit bananas. And so, yeah, I've got some vacation coming up, and it's needed because I feel like, yeah, my pandemic hobby has been like, oh, we can do this all virtual now. Oh, that means we could do like 5 times as much as I was doing before. And all these clients that I used to have to say no to because they were too far away for me to fly, now we can do them no problem. And I just worked like an idiot the last year. Yeah, that's
Awesome,
my
and
pandemic.
I heard you might be writing a second book. No.
Well, I'm thinking about it. I'm working on an idea that I think that would be good in a book form, but I'm still in the phase where like it's a thing that I do with clients. It relates to positioning, and we do it in the work that I do with them. But I think that I'm still in the phase where I'm learning how best to teach it. And
Mm.
so I'm doing some conference talks on it. I'm doing some work with clients on it. And so once I get to the point where I think I can teach it in a way that everybody really gets it, then it'll be book form, but it's a little way out from that yet.
I love it. I love how you kind of structure this, like teach it first and then figure out like the analogies because obviously
Yeah.
awesome has some of the best analogies I can think of. I'm gonna bring them up very shortly, but let's jump right in about to talk about positioning. The very first chapter you've laid out exactly what's on the line if people get positioning wrong. I love this quote. I'm gonna read it right now. If we fail at positioning, we fail at marketing and sales. If we fail at marketing and sales, the entire business fails. For people who don't know, I'm also putting together a book on product-led onboarding. I say if you fail at positioning, there's no onboarding tactic that's gonna
Right.
save that. There's no product tour. There's no onboarding emails that is gonna save that. For people tuning in right now, why is positioning do or die for businesses?
Yeah. Like if you think about it, the positioning is a really misunderstood concept, right? So people think that positioning is the same thing as messaging, or positioning is the same thing as a tagline or our market strategy, or my personal pet peeve is people talk about brand positioning, and I don't know what brand positioning is. There's positioning and there's branding, and those two things are actually very separate. But the
Interesting.
things that we confuse with positioning, in my opinion, are outputs of positioning. Like I can't do messaging until I understand, well, who's the message for, and what's the message, what's the value that we're trying to get across. And if we're trying to prove that we're different from competitors, who are those competitors? I need to understand that stuff first before I can do messaging. Same thing with branding. Like, how am I supposed to know what the branding is supposed to represent if I don't understand who's my best fit customers and what's the value I'm trying to communicate? So if you think about everything we do in marketing and sales has a basic set of inputs, those inputs are defined by positioning. So, in my mind, my definition of positioning defines how your product is the best in the world at delivering some value that a well-defined set of customers cares a lot about. So baked into there is my definition of who do I compete with? How am I different? What is the differentiated value that my product can deliver for customers that the others can't? What customers am I trying to go after? And what's the market I intend to win? I need to do that before I can do anything. I can't build sales strategy. I can't build a marketing strategy. I can't build content. I can't run a campaign. I can't do anything until I know that stuff. So that's how important this positioning stuff is. It's the foundation for everything we're doing on the marketing and sales side.
Really, really fascinating. You said something there that positioning is not branding, and I think I read it somewhere that can you explain a little bit? And there's also brand positioning. You're right. Like, what the heck is that even? So
I
can
hate
you
it. Well, okay.
go for it?
Here's one thing. So I'll throw this out. People use that word branding and they just throw it around. I mean, almost anything right now. So, whenever I get into this conversation, people will just say, oh, well, that's not my definition of branding. And it's like, well, we can't have branding mean everything here, people. Like what exactly is branding? So usually when we're talking about branding and people talk about, the brand lives in the minds of the customer and all that stuff. But what the brand normally is when we're talking about, like, if you hired an outside agency to work on your branding, what would they be working on? They'd be working on this sort of combination of colors, fonts, iconography, imagery, all the things that come together that are not messaging, that come together to represent what you're all about. So that's my idea. The traditional idea of branding is it's that stuff. And so that's not positioning. It represents your positioning if you're doing it well, but it's not positioning at all. Now, some people will say, oh, no, well, that's not branding. Branding is, that, and they'll start saying that branding also includes messaging. And it's like, well, the messaging and branding are two different things. And then I've seen some people basically define branding as like everything we do in marketing, which is nonsense, in my opinion. So I'm using the traditional definition of branding, which is, colors, fonts, brand tone of voice, iconography, imagery, all that sort of stuff that comes together to sort of give people a feeling about what you're all about.
Really fascinating. It sounds like a rant. It sounds like a rant that you probably can go on and on about.
Well, I think this is a big problem we have in marketing, in that we can't agree on definitions of things, and then we get confused about what the things are. And I think we do that to our detriment.
Interesting. It's like that the whole point around, if you ask 20 marketers or 20 product marketers what positioning is, you'll get 25 different
answers.
25
and so it's part of the reason why I think we're so terrible at doing positioning. If we can't even agree on what it is, how could we ever get to a methodology for doing it? So, but I don't think it's that hard. Like, I mean, we can go back to first principles in positioning. We know the original positioning research. We know where it came from. We can read the original text on positioning and go back to that definition and work it from there. And that definition is really about, if we go back to the Rees and Trout book, for example, Positioning: The Battle for Your Mind, they talked about positioning being, you being able to occupy a very distinct space in the prospect's mind. And so that encompasses a lot of things. It's distinct from what? Distinct from your competitors. Distinct for what? That's your value. And then, I don't care about every customer in the land. I care about my particular target customers. So it does, like, we can agree on the piece parts of what positioning are if we go back to the, straight definition of it. But, like I say, like out in the world, marketers will try to define positioning as other things. And I just reject those definitions.
I love it. I probably can get you going on this, but one of the, we're talking about analogies. This other analogy I really, really love in your book around how positioning is essentially like context setting, like the beginning of a movie. Can you talk a little bit about how that essentially positioning is you're setting context very much, like a movie.
This took me a long time to figure out. So when I started doing positioning work as a consultant, part of the problem is I'm coming in and saying, hey, I'm going to help you with your positioning. But if you don't even know what positioning is, how are you going to hire me to help you to do that? So then people would say, well, what do you mean by positioning? And so I got to the point where I had all these different analogies, to try and describe it. And so the one I like the best right now is the opening scene of a movie analogy. So think back pre-pandemic when we used to go to the movies. The job of the opening scene of the movie is to get you oriented, right? Because you walk in off the street, you sit down, the lights are low, the movie comes up, and you're like, you get the first scene of the movie and you have all these big questions like, where are we? What time frame is this? What is going on? Who are these people? What is the mood of this movie? How should I be feeling? And you can't pay attention to a thing until you get those big questions answered. And all you're doing in the opening scene of the movie is looking for clues, right? Like, I'm looking at the cars. That'll tell me what the time frame is. I'm looking at the skyline. That'll tell me where we are. Almost every American movie opens with a panning shot of the skyline. They're like, once you notice it, you'll never unsee it. Almost every movie starts. And it's because it's like, oh, I recognize that building. We're in New York. Oh, I recognize that bridge. We're in San Francisco. Oh, I recognize this. And that's because a movie that takes place in New York is very different from a movie that takes place in San Francisco. A movie that takes place in Chicago isn't the same movie that takes place in Miami. So American movies always start like this. So so if we think about positioning as context setting, the job is kind of the same as the job of the opening scene of a movie, right? Let's get you oriented. Let's answer your big questions so you can settle in and pay attention to the details. So the example that I use the most is the opening scene of Apocalypse Now.
Yeah.
Just because it's a great opening scene and it illustrates this. So the opening scene of Apocalypse Now, it starts out with this really nice scene of a beach. Like, it's nice. There's palm trees. There's tinkly music. It's lovely. And you might be walking in and going, man, it's not apocalypse right now. This looks pretty good. Maybe it's apocalypse half an hour from now. But then what happens is, the music starts getting a little bit more intense. We see a bit of like, looks like dust. And then we realize, no, actually that's smoke. And then a helicopter flies by and then boom, they set a beach on fire and the music's all intense. And it's Jim Morrison saying, this is the end, my friend. And you're like, oh my God, it's apocalypse right now. I'm right in the middle of the Vietnam War. This is serious. And then it switches from the helicopter to Martin Sheen. And he's in this hotel room and it's a disaster. And he's drinking and smoking. He's clearly in distress. He walks over to the window. He peeks out the blinds and we get the first line of dialogue in the movie, which is actually his thoughts. And he looks out the blinds and he says, Saigon, shit, I'm still only in Saigon. Every time I think I'm going to wake up back in the jungle. So I'm 3 minutes into this movie. I got one line of dialogue and I know a lot. Like, we're in the middle of the Vietnam War. Specifically, we're in Saigon. Our lead character has been there before and it didn't go so good. And we know that because he's like full on PTSD. We know the feeling of this movie. This is not going to be a laugh riot. This is going to be really intense. Now I get it. Now I can settle in and I can pay attention to the details of the story. Positioning does the exact same thing. When I encounter something brand new that I've never encountered before, I will look for clues to try and figure out, what is this thing all about? And those clues will include things like branding, for example, or I'll look at the pricing, and the lower price things are for SMBs and higher price things are for enterprise. I'll look at the customers you're choosing to highlight and say, oh, do those customers look like me or do they not look like me? I'll look at the features you choose to highlight. I'll look at, if you mention a competitor, I will then compare you to that competitor. If you declare that you are in a market category, I'm going to use that. Because if you say your email, well, then I assume you compete with Gmail. I assume you have a calendar. I assume you have an inbox. But if you tell me, oh, no, actually, we're chat, even though email and chat are 99% feature overlapping, I got a really different set of expectations. Oh, now you compete with WhatsApp. I don't expect you to have a calendar. I don't expect you to have a spam filter. There's a whole bunch of things. My expectations for chat are totally different than email. So this context setting, if you could think of positioning as context setting, that's kind of what it is. It's about taking a prospect that doesn't know anything about your stuff, and you kind of pick them up and you put them on the road that leads them to what you're all about. You still got to do messaging and all the other stuff to get them fully there. But it helps set the context so that, they're pointed in the right direction. They're a certain amount of the way there. And now you move them over here, as opposed to, if I set you up with the wrong context, then sales is going to have to guide you all the way over here and turn you around and say, no, we're not email. We're not email. We're actually this other thing. Please come over here before I can sell you something.
I love that. And I love Apocalypse Now. Like, that's a great movie. And now I look back at other movies, and the first 5 minutes are super important, like Batman Begins or other things like that.
If you look at the opening scene of almost every movie, sets a whole, but like I used to show in workshops, I used to show the opening scene of Baby Driver, which nobody remembers the opening scene of Baby Driver, but the opening scene of Baby Driver is actually genius, and you should go back and watch it on YouTube. You can Google it, opening scene Baby Driver. It's really good. Like, they give you these subtle clues about where they are. They don't do the city skyline, but they show you that it's like Atlanta National Bank or something. And so we're in Atlanta. You get a little introduction to the characters. You get a little introduction to like the feel of the movie, where they have all these things that go in time with the music. Anyways, it's a genius opening scene. I used to use that one in workshops because it was fun to show it to people and then dissect the scene, but it's genius.
I love it. I love that movie as well. Really, really great movie. You're starting to get to it a little bit already. Like, what are the symptoms of weak positioning? You talked about sales cycle, but another quote I love from your book, and that analogy, you said, weak positioning is like speaking Japanese slowly and loudly to a person who only speak English. And it's really that. Like, you're trying to speak a different language to somebody else. So I guess the question I have is, what are some symptoms of weak positioning? Obviously, there's ones where like, I don't know what you're speaking to me in a different language, but like, what are some other symptoms that you've listed out that you can share with folks?
So I spent the first 25 years of my career being a repeat vice president of marketing. So, you would hire me in, and usually the idea was, April, you need to fix lead gen, and we just got to get revenue going up to the right, and please fix that. And so generally I would come in, and the first thing I'd try to do is assess whether or not the positioning was bad, because if it was bad, we're going to have to fix that first before we can go do anything else. And the easiest way for me to figure that out was to sit in on sales calls. And what you would hear on sales calls, when the positioning was weak, you could see the signs. So the most common sign was the rep would come in, and they would do the first part of the pitch, like, hey, we're this, and we do this and this and this. And they get maybe 10 minutes in, and you could just feel this confusion of the customers. The customers would be like, yeah, so what is it again? Say that again. And there would be this, and the rep would be, oh, and then they back up 3 slides and do the pitch again. And the customer would still be like, so, and then you would get this other thing where you could feel the customers grasping for the comparison. So they'd say, so you're like Salesforce, and the rep would be like, no, man, that's a CRM, and we're not that, and blah, 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 and they do this thing. So the second sign so the first sign is total confusion, right? We pitch you the thing and they still don't know what it is. Second sign is they're trying to figure it out. And they're trying to figure it out by comparing you to someone else, but they're comparing you to people that you don't compare to, right? So they're like, oh, so you're like Gmail. No, we're not. Oh, you're like Salesforce. No, we're not even in that space. So it's an indication that something in the way you're pitching this thing is sparking this set of assumption that says, oh, it must be CRM. Oh, it must be email. And you're not that. So there's a gap between what the customers are trying to figure out and what you actually are. So those are usually the main 2 signs. Sometimes you'll get into things like, you'll get through the pitch and people say, I get what you are, and I get what you're like. I just don't get why I would pay money for that. And that's a terrible one, where it's like, people get what you are. They don't think your value is valuable.
Wow.
So you'll get that one where they're like, yeah, that sounds great. I just don't know why I would give you my cold hard cash to actually do that. The other one you'll get sometimes is and you'll get this when companies are overselling it, is you'll get this thing where people say, yeah, I think I get it. And if you could do that, that would be amazing. But I do not believe you can do that. and so sometimes you'll get that one where, it's so far out ahead of where you are that it just sounds like fantasy, or it sounds like you're pitching me the vision. You're not actually pitching me the thing. Or people will be like, yeah, that'd be fantastic for really advanced companies, but not for us, man. Like we don't do that. So that's another sign too. Like you've got a customer or prospect that should be right in your sweet spot. And they're like, yeah, that sounds good, just not for me. These are all, in my mind, these are all the signs of weak positioning.
Really fascinating. You're starting to get to it a little bit already. One of the weak positioning is to compare you to a CRM that's really like they're trying to look for that competitive alternative. And that's where I want to get to next, is around that 5 plus 1 components of effective positioning. And the example you brought up, I love your examples. They're just so good. The cake pop, right? Like exactly with the cake pop.
Yeah.
Can you apply that 5 elements in, whether it's that cake pop or something else, just looking at each one, because I think it would be fun to hear.
So one of the examples I use in the book is this idea of cake versus a cake pop. So, and I first got this idea when, again, I was trying to come up with different analogies that I could use to describe positioning to people that aren't marketers so that they would get it. And I had this thought one day. I walked into the coffee shop, and we're in Canada, it's Tim Hortons. So I walk into the Tim Hortons, and they got a sign up, and it's breakfast, right? And it says, try our double chocolate salted caramel muffin. And I'm like, muffin? That's not a muffin. That is literally a piece of cake, but they have positioned it as breakfast. So then I got thinking about that. What's the difference between a cake and a muffin? It's positioning. And then a few weeks later, I walked into the Starbucks, and I was looking at the cake pops, and I was like, same thing with this, right? Like this is cake on a stick, positioned in a different way. So the example I use, and it was more to illustrate the idea that, we often start out with a default position in our minds when the product gets invented, but then, the product almost outgrows its market category, or the thing that it ends up being isn't actually best positioned the way we intended it. So like, you woke up in the morning and said, what sucks? Email sucks. I'm going to make better email. But you add features, you take features away. Customers like this, they don't like that. The market itself is evolving, and now we have chat and we have team collaboration, all these other things. Fast forward 2 years later, and you still think it's email because that's what you set out to build. But a new customer coming at it from the outside says, well, I don't know. It doesn't have a calendar, and it doesn't have whatever. That doesn't make any sense. And I don't know what this thing is. And so I used to do this bit in conference talks where I would talk about, like let's say you're a baker and you woke up in the morning and you said, hey, I'm going to innovate the heck out of cake. And so I'm going to have cake, but I want to make it portable so that I can drink coffee in one end and have a cake snack thing in the other hand. And so I developed this thing, and it's like a little ball of cake, and I put it on a stick. And then I decide I'm going to pitch it to Starbucks. And then so I call up Starbucks and say, hey, I got this thing. It's amazing. It's cake, but it's like cake, but a small morsel of cake. And I wanted to make it portable. So I wanted to give it a handle. It's not really a handle. It's like a stick. So I've got this thing, and it's like cake on a stick. It's like cake 2.0. It's like advanced cake, right? But the lady on the other end, she's like, that's not cake, my man. Like that's cake doing things cake wasn't. I don't want cake on a stick. That sounds stupid. And that's because I declared it as cake. And so I said it was cake. So what wins a cake contest? Like the cakiest cake in town. Like I want frosting. That's what I want on a cake. And I want a lot of it. And I don't want a small piece of cake. I want a big piece of cake. It's dessert, man. And I want all these things. And what's special about my invention? Well, it's the ball and the stick, and that has nothing to do with cake. And so why am I positioning it as cake? So I could back the whole thing up and say, you know what? If I focus in on the things that are special about it, it's not actually the cake. The cake is the least interesting thing about it. So I could actually position it as a lollipop, right? And say, it's a lollipop for grown-ups at the coffee shop. Well, then of course, then I picture it perfectly now. Of course, it's got a stick. Of course, it's got a little ball. And hey, it's made out of cake. That's cool, right? It's a bonus. So a cake pop is very different from cake on a stick. So I think that you need to understand what's differentiated and special about your stuff. And then you need to take a step back and say, what is the best context to position that product in, so that the differentiated cool stuff that you've got is right in the middle of the market category, instead of saying, oh yeah, all my cool stuff is over here. Like, and it doesn't even belong in that, and I'm positioning it as cake, but it's like, what? So why does it have a stick then? Whereas if I position it as a lollipop, it's like, well, of course it's a ball and whatever. And it's a specialized lollipops for grown-ups at the coffee shop. Yeah, I get it. Let's move on. Right. So that's my speech about that.
I love it. I love it. Like, can you apply? So many things that I can think about for cake pops. Like once I read your book, I don't look at cake pops the same anymore. I go to Starbucks and like think about your book.
Freaking send me pictures of cake pops all the time. Like people think I'm the cake pop lady. Like I get all this stuff. When I used to do workshops face to face, like more than once, a client has brought in cake pops as the snack, because they read that thing in the book.
That's so funny.
Hey, there's a question in the chat that I'd love to address.
Sure. Okay. Which one is it?
So somebody has a question. How is Jobs to Be Done? I lost it because it scrolled. How is Jobs to Be Done philosophy influenced your views on positioning? I want to answer this because Jobs to Be Done had a big influence on me. So when I was starting out, trying to figure this stuff out, I started with the idea that if we want to do good positioning, and this is probably because I have an engineering background and this is the way engineers would think about it, but I thought, if we really want to do good positioning, we should be able to break positioning down into component pieces, solve for the individual component pieces, and then put it back together. And that's how we get good positioning. And so breaking it down into pieces was easy because we kind of agree on the component pieces of positioning. So the component pieces are competitive alternatives, unique capabilities or features, differentiated value for customers, your target market segments. So who's your target customer? And the last one is market category. What's the market you intend to win? So those are the 5. And so then you sit down and you say, okay, all I got to do is figure out the best answer for each of those. But what struck me when I tried to do that was the first thing you realize is like all those pieces actually have a relationship to each other. So if I pull any piece out of that, like let's pull differentiated value. Where does differentiated value come from? It doesn't come out of the air. The only place it comes from is differentiated capabilities, right? So these two things are tied. I can't do one without the other. But then if I think about it, where do differentiated capabilities come from? Well, they're only differentiated if I compare them to a competitive alternative. So that's related too. And then if I get to like, well, who are the best fit customers for my solution? Well, this is basically customers that care a lot about my differentiated value. So I can't figure that out until I know value. And then the last one's market category. And if we think about market category as context setting, like the best market category for your product is the context that you position your product in, such that my differentiated value kind of makes sense to my target customers. So I got these 5 things and they're all related to each other. Where do I start?
Right.
And for the longest time, I decided that's why we don't have a positioning methodology, because there is no starting place. And so the best we can do is sort of pick a random place to start, work our way around the wheel, get candidate positioning, go out to the market, test it. If it passes, if it works, great, we keep it. If it doesn't, we throw it out and we work our way around the wheel again. And I did it like that literally for 2 years. And what got me out of that mess was Clayton Christensen. So after 2 years of doing it like that, I went way down the Clayton Christensen rat hole, jobs to be done. And I sat with this for a long time thinking about, how does jobs theory fit into my positioning thing? Because at the beginning, I couldn't see the intersection. I was like, how does this actually relate? And the epiphany that I had was, I went back and I was reading that story about the milkshake. I don't know if you know Jobs to be done.
Milkshake.
So there's a story about the milkshake, and they discovered that people were buying a lot of milkshakes in the drive-through, and they were like, wow, that's so weird. And they did this Jobs to be done interviews, and what they discovered was people were using the milkshake like breakfast, right? Like they were, they ordered in the morning and they got a long drive and they don't want to eat something messy that's going to fall all over their front. And they want something that sits in the cup holder, but at the same time, the drive is boring. So they don't want it to be over in 10 seconds, so that nice thick milkshake, it lasts for a long time. And so they discovered this, and this allowed them to build a better milkshake to meet those jobs. And so I was sitting there looking at that, and I had this moment where I was like, oh, it's actually a positioning problem. It's not a milkshake, man. It's a smoothie. What you have is a smoothie. Right. Because if I call it a milkshake, and the difference was competitive comparables. If I'm thinking about it, if it's a milkshake and I think of it as like, my drink with dinner, then what's my competition? My competition is Coke. But if I'm thinking about it like breakfast, and what the Jobs to be done interviews showed was the competition was not Coke for that particular type of use. The competition was Egg McMuffin.
Yeah.
Right? Or something else you'd have for breakfast, Danish muffin, something like that. So the breakthrough that this gave me, and how this relates to my work is what it told me is that the first step of my positioning process actually has to be competitive alternatives. And competitive alternatives is not the same as competitors.
Yeah.
Because it's what a customer would do if you didn't exist. And so for most B2B tech companies, the competitive alternatives are, there's competitors, but there's also whatever they're doing status quo in the account, which is like, I use a spreadsheet, or I get an intern to do it, or it's just manual processes with a bunch of junk. And so that counts as a competitive alternative, because I got to beat that in order to get a deal. But that's not my only competitive alternative. Usually there's that, which is status quo in the account, but there's also, when the customer decides they're going to do something different, in B2B, they'll make a short list. Who else is on the short list? Because I got to beat them too. So my thinking on step one has to be, if you didn't exist, what would the customer do? And that's status quo or the other things on the short list. This is who I got to beat in order to win a deal. And so if I've got a product that's out in the market today that's already selling, I can figure that out. This is who I got to beat to win a deal. And then I can say, okay, that's who I got to beat to win a deal. What have I got that they don't have? That's my differentiated capabilities. So I got and here's all my capabilities. And then I can map those capabilities to value and go down the capabilities one by one. Like, so what that you have a 25 megapixel camera? So what that you have whatever your features are? Right. And that gets me to differentiated value themes, 2 or 3 of those, and I can map the features in underneath. So now I've got differentiated value. Once I get that, then I can say, okay, I can go sell this thing to any company, but what are the characteristics of a target account that make them care a lot about my differentiated value? That's literally the definition of my best fit customer. And that's where you want to focus your marketing and sales efforts. Now I got that. Then I can say, okay, then I can get into market category where I'm like, okay, I got this, I got this value. I'm delivering this value to these customers. Am I email or am I chat? Am I a database or am I team collaboration or am I business intelligence tool? And then we can get to market category. So it's my super long-winded explanation of where I think the intersection is between jobs to be done and my stuff. Like most of the places where I've seen the jobs work used is it's used for feature prioritization and trying to figure out what we should build next. In my work, I think the job stuff is very good thinking to help you figure out what are the actual alternate solutions to what you do, and thinking about what would a customer do if you didn't exist, because there's a difference between the customer saying, it's Oracle versus it's Joey the intern, which is the same difference between Coke versus Egg McMuffin in my mind.
That's so good, and that's if people have run through the jobs to be done interview style, that's exactly what they go through. They go through the very beginning and look at what are they looking at, what are they currently doing, like right from the beginning of the story.
What made you switch, like that? And so for a long time, and after that, in the jobs that I had, we would go do job style interviews, except we were trying to get positioning out of it. So we would say, if we landed a new customer, we go in and do these interviews where we'd say, okay, let's take us back. Like, what were you doing before? And they'd say, oh, we had an intern. Oh, we had a spreadsheet. And then I'd say, great. Well, what made you decide you had to do something different? And that's important in marketing. That's the trigger event, right? Like, so something happened, right? Joey made a mistake or, something. And then it was like, okay, well, then you decide you're going to do something different. Well, what else did you look at? That gives me my short list of alternatives, like who else was on there. And then you picked us. Why'd you pick us? And importantly, why did you not pick the other folks? And so we do interviews like that, again, to be able to get the stake in the ground of competitive alternatives. Once we understood that, then we could pull out the rest of the positioning from that. What you don't want to do is walk in and say to your customers, why do you love us? That's a stupid interview, and no one should ever do that.
That's so great. I love it. Thank you for sharing that. I'm just like,
that's what everyone wants to do. Everyone wants to do this thing where they call up the customers and say, why do you love us so much? And the customers will say, because you're just so nice. You're so nice. Like your support's so great. And literally no one picked you for that reason, right? They had no reason to call support until after they bought you. They didn't know you were nice. They didn't know your support was good. Like that's literally not why they picked you. I mean, okay, in some weird edge cases, it is true, but yeah. So,
thank you for sharing that. It's all connecting to me. Like that's your step one in your process. People can read up, but I'm going to take some questions from the audience or from the comments. The first one at the very beginning from Cassian is, April, how do you spread the word inside the company about the importance of positioning? What tips? And this is about buy-in. What if the CEO or founder is like, we don't believe in positioning, or this is a waste of our time?
Yeah. So as a person that used to be the VP marketing, like that'd be job number one. Like, so first thing I'd have to decide if the positioning was good or bad. And then if I discovered that the positioning was bad, the first thing to realize is you can't fix it on your own. Even if you're the VP marketing, you can't fix it on your own, because the whole company is going to have to be bought into this new positioning. And you're going to need the whole executive team to come together to work on it. And there's no point in even trying to do a repositioning without that. So here's how I would do it. The pain of weak positioning is often first recognized by marketing, because we get what positioning is more or less. So we know how to look for it. But who else feels it right at the beginning? Sales feels it, right? They feel it every time that customer says, so you're like Salesforce, and you're like, no, we're not, right? Sales knows it because their pitch isn't working. That's how they know it. So what I would do is, instead of running to the CEO and say, hey, guess what? Your baby's ugly, like your positioning sucks. Like that's a good way to get fired in your first week. Don't do that. What I do instead is I go hang out in sales. So I'm there anyways. I'm listening to the calls and I'm just taking a lot of notes. And I would be having lunch with the VP sales and say, hey, sat in on this call today, really interesting. Like, they kept trying to compare us to Salesforce. You guys ever get that? The VP sales is, oh yeah, we get that all the time. Like, yeah, that sucks, doesn't it? Yeah, oh yeah, it does. It sucks. And then we gotta do this, we gotta do that. And here's another thing I noticed. I noticed that like when we get to this part in the presentation, they don't seem to really get what we are. Like, and the sales rep says, oh yeah, that's true. And then I'll say, well, you know what? In marketing, we tend to think of that as a positioning problem. Like, we know customers love us once they buy it because we got all these happy customers. But at the beginning, there's this gap between what a customer that uses our stuff knows and, something in our pitch is making people think we're something else. And so I got to feel like, I don't know, I'm new in town here. I don't know, but I got a feeling that maybe the positioning is weak. Like, have we ever looked at the positioning? Did we ever do anything on positioning? You ever heard the word positioning around this town before? VP sales, they usually say, no, but if I can convince the VP sales that it's worth looking at, now I got some, right? Then I would go and do the same thing with product. So I go over product management and say, hey, I'll tell you something funny I heard over in sales. So I don't know nothing. I'm new in town. But I keep seeing, people are getting us confused with this or whatever. And have we ever done any positioning work here? Because this feels like sort of a weak positioning thing. And so I'd have to spend a couple of weeks with the guys in product, maybe, and then I got to get them convinced. And then sometimes, depending on the company, if it's a SaaS company, you probably want to go do the same thing, customer success, because they're trying to do cross-selling and upselling and stuff. And that's a bit like hanging out with sales. So I go over there and do the same thing. Like, hey, when you go to do expansion in account, you ever notice this? Like, they compare us in the wrong way and they don't understand it. So then I get everybody there sort of on side. Then I would go to the CEO and I'd say, look, I've been spending some time in sales and product and customer success. And I'm not saying the positioning's bad. I'm not, because it's not for me to know. I'm brand new here. Maybe I'm wrong, but I feel like it would be a good exercise to revisit it. And so how we do that is we'll get the executive team together and we're going to do this little structured process over a couple of days. And let's check in on it. Maybe I'm wrong and we'll do this thing and it comes out exactly what it is right now. No harm, no foul. But I suspect that there's places we could tighten it up. And you know what the CEO says? CEO says, what's John in sales think about this? And I'll say, well, you should call him. I don't know. Let's call John. Let's get John on the phone. And John says, oh, yeah, I've been thinking about this for a while. And then they'll say, what about Jessica over at customer success? I don't know. Let's call Jessica and see, gets Jessica on the phone. So I have to get half the executive team sort of seeing eye to eye with me. Then I go to the CEO and I'm not saying let's burn it all down and start fresh. I'm saying, let's just look at it. So that would get me everybody in the room. Now this is an important piece. So now I got everybody in the room, but I can't just get everybody in the room and have a free-for-all conversation. That's going to be a disaster. Because if I get everyone in the room and we don't have a structured process to do this, and it's just a battle of opinions, then guess what? Marketing never wins that, right? Like if it's a battle of opinions, it's going to be, well, I think people love us because of this. Well, I think people love us because of this. And either the VP sales or the CEO wins, usually the CEO, but sometimes the VP sales. One of those win, you don't win. You don't even get to talk. If it's a battle of opinions, that's it, the end. So you don't want that. What you want is you want to work through a structured process that, as much as you can, takes the opinions out of it. And so my positioning process evolved to be that process. We get everybody together in the room, and then it's like, okay, well, let's start with facts. We can all agree, especially if you have a sales team and it's B2B, we all know who the competitive alternatives are. And if we don't know, we got salespeople in the room and they'll tell us, right? This is status quo in the account. This is who we get compared to. That's who we got to beat in order to win a deal. And then we say, okay, well, what do we have that they don't have? These are just facts. These just is what it is. And then I can map those to value. And often what I get there is differentiated value that looks very, very different from what the answer would be if I put everybody in the room and said, why does everybody love us so much? And it's a battle of opinions. But if I do differentiated value that way, it's kind of hard to argue with. Like, this is who we got to beat. This is how we're different. This is the value. Where else does it come from? So in my world, that's how I would get buy-in, and then that's how I would move the thing along. Like, you got to work the team before you go to the CEO. I got to get the whole team together, and then, very important, once we're all together, we got to follow a structured process. Otherwise, the thing's just going to turn into I think this, and I think this, and I like my opinion the best, so it wins.
I love your stories. It's just so captivating. I just how you're saying this, even with the voice from the sales. It just thank you so much. That was one of the best answers I've heard for how
Everybody
to
in
get
marketing
buy-in
has had
for
that
anything.
conversation with the sales guy.
On a related question around what would you do if you don't have you're still early, like, and this is a question from Ala around product validation stage, and she's asking about do you wait with branding, but I want to apply this further and say, how do you apply positioning when you don't have any best fit customers, so to speak, as well?
So how do you, sorry, you're still in the validation stage. Yeah. So here's the thing. Well, again, the question about branding, I think that's a totally separate thing, and you can totally wait on branding because you don't need branding to get your first wave of customers, to be honest. If it's B2B, I don't think you need it. For positioning, in your first wave of customers, you actually, counterintuitively, you actually want to keep the positioning kind of loose. Like what you have at the beginning is a positioning thesis. So your thesis is, I think we compete with this. I think our differentiators are this. They have differentiated values, this. Here's who's going to love us. This is the market we're going to win. You think that, but it's a thesis. And in my experience, your thesis is always wrong, at least a little bit. And so what you want to do is keep it kind of loose because you don't know where to tighten it up yet. And it's not going to stop you from getting your first wave of customers because generally you're going to do unnatural things to get your first wave of customers anyway. So the analogy I use is like, let's say you design a fishing net, but your thesis is it's a tuna fishing net because that's how you design it. You're a specialist in tuna. You design a special tuna fishing net. Now you could position it that way and maybe it catches a lot of tuna, maybe it doesn't, right? But instead what you could do is say, you know what? It's a net for fish, all kinds of fish, big fish, like, and then get your first bunch of customers and they're trying it out in all different parts of the ocean. And let's just see what they pull up. Right. And maybe what they pull up is a lot of grouper. And then you could say, okay, now I've got my first wave. I know it kicks ass for grouper. So now I can tighten it up and say it's a grouper fishing net. So at the beginning, you actually want to keep it kind of loose and don't tighten it up too much because you don't know where exactly to tighten. I wanted to answer this other question here was how does positioning influence product development, and does it only hit marketing and sales? Can I do that one?
Yep.
So I think it touches development a lot. It just doesn't necessarily hit development right out of the gate. So I'll give you an example. So I worked on a product, and what we thought it was at the beginning was desktop productivity software, but what we saw people using it with, and what we eventually repositioned it as, was an embeddable database for mobile devices. So if you can imagine, right, our product roadmap for desktop productivity software looked very different than our product roadmap for an embeddable database for mobile devices. So at the beginning, it was the same product and we just repositioned it. It didn't change much. It changed a lot in marketing. It changed a lot in sales. We changed a lot in terms of the go-to-market. Like, we didn't have salespeople before, and now we had salespeople. But then it really changed the product roadmap because it was like our vision of what we wanted to be in the future was really different. So I had another one that we thought it was a database. We repositioned it as a business intelligence tool, or actually a data warehouse. And again, it really changed our vision on the product roadmap because before we were trying to get feature parity with databases. And then it was like, oh, well, for a data warehouse, there's a whole different set of features that people would expect that we have. And therefore, we need to work on a different roadmap. So, usually the immediate aftermath of a repositioning is, it's the same product. You're just talking about it different, but the expectations on your roadmap start to really change. And so it does change what you're doing downstream and the way you prioritize stuff and what it is you're building and what people expect to have in the future.
I love it. Thank you for sharing that. A related question on this note around what comes first, positioning or product. It sounds like a chicken or egg problem. Like, I'm guessing they go hand in hand.
Oh, yeah. Well, so here's what I believe. So if in a startup, right, if we believe in lean startup, so let's say we're building a lean startup methodology, right? We're starting with, like I said before, a positioning thesis, right? So I've got a thesis that says And I should know what this is. I should be able to articulate it and say, this is who I compare to. This is how I'm different. This is my differentiated value. Here's who's going to love my stuff. And here's the market I intend to win. But at the beginning, it's just a thesis. And then we get it out in the market and we get a first wave of customers, and then we tighten it up. So for me, as a positioning consultant, people come to me and say, okay, I have this thing and I'm about to launch it. And, I want help with my positioning. And I'm like, you don't need my help, because what you have right now is just a thesis. It's just a thesis. It's either right or it's wrong. You should know what the thesis is, because you should be trying to validate it once you're out in the market. But so it's the wrong time to bring in a consultant. Now, here's what happens though. You bring it out to the market, the thing starts selling, you've got a bunch of things. If you're not conscious of your positioning, then you're not conscious of the fact that you need to tighten it up and where you need to tighten it up. And so a lot of the companies I work with are Series A or Series B, and they've had positioning that worked really good up until they got to a certain stage, or they got to a certain size, or they started breaking into new markets, and all of a sudden the positioning's not so good. And that's an excellent time to say, let's hit pause, let's back up, and let's really tighten up the positioning so that it matches where the product's at right now. But at the beginning, all you've got is you got a positioning thesis and a product, and those things are being built in tandem, right? The product is the physical representation of your positioning thesis. So you should know what that is. But when it hits the market, who knows what happens, right? It never goes according to plan. And so later on, you're going to want to reposition. So, and it never stops, unfortunately, because your product keeps evolving. The market itself keeps evolving. Competitors are coming in and coming out. And so positioning isn't just like, I carve it in stone and then that's it, and I get to walk away and not think about it anymore. Like generally you're checking in on it every 6 months and saying, have the competitors changed? Have our capabilities changed, or have our competitors' capabilities changed? And what used to be differentiating isn't anymore. Therefore, it's changing the value. And you have to keep checking in on it. And what usually happens is over time, your positioning evolves.
I mean, on that note, this is so many follow-up questions, and it's related to somebody's question here around what do you do when you got into that point where now you're splintering off to different markets or different countries. And unfortunately, this will be the last question for everybody. So many questions here because we're about to hit the hour. Like, what would you suggest around that? Like, would it make sense to have a company that has different product positioning for the different countries or market?
Well, so here's the thing. Like, if we come back to the methodology, right? The first step is, what would they be doing if you didn't exist? Now, sometimes that's not remarkably different country to country. Like the competitors are the same, right? You're still competing with Excel and Oracle, and it's the same. And so if the competitors aren't wildly different, then nothing else is different, and you can use the same positioning and it'll work in two different geographies. Where you get into a little bit more complexity is where it's like, I got a big competitor that's really good, but only in Germany. And then if I sell into Germany, I got to prove why we're better than them. Well, then you're going to have to take that into account in your positioning. I would say that 99% of the companies I work with manage to have positioning that works globally because the competitive mix just isn't that different. There may be a few outlier competitors that are slightly different, or we see IBM more than Oracle in this country and it's reverse in that country, but we've already accounted for it in our positioning, so it's the same. The majority of the time your positioning works fine country to country. Where it doesn't is if you have real regional differences in the comparables. And you say, well, look, in North America, status quo is all a spreadsheet, but when I go to Europe, everybody's using competitor XYZ that doesn't even sell into North America, then yeah, your positioning for the two geographies is going to have to be different. But I would go through the exercise and validate that, because a lot of companies come to me and they assume that they're going to have completely different positioning all over the place, and it's not. It's like, I live in Canada and there really isn't any difference really in buyer behavior for the vast majority of things between Canada and the US. You can take your US positioning. It works just fine in Canada and vice versa. The Canadians would be mad if I say this, but it's true, right? And, we have a part of the country that has French language requirement. And so, you might have to consider that. And, currency is different. And there's a couple other things, but, not that different. And so the vast majority of companies that sell Canada and the US, it's the same positioning, same ads, same everything. Some, for certain products, yeah, you are going to have to take in the regional stuff into account because the comparables are different.
Oh man, it's so good. I wish I had a few more hours with you, April. We have a ton of questions, but I want to be respectful of your time, and to everybody who showed up, thank you so much. I really do appreciate.
No problem.
People, obviously people should buy the book, right? I have it right in front of me.
Everything I know about positioning, I have attempted to capture in that book. So yeah, if you want to figure out what's in this head, it's all in there.
Awesome. And anywhere else you want to send people follow
that's Twitter, it. Like, I mean, my website is aprildunford.com. So, if you work at a company that's interested in doing positioning work with me, you can go there and find out about what I do as a consultant. I'm not really very active on a lot of social media with the exception of Twitter, and even Twitter, I'm a bit of a lazy tweeter, but occasionally my hot takes are out there on Twitter.
They go viral.
Yeah, if you want to follow me somewhere, that's probably the best place to find me right now.
Awesome. April, have a great rest of your afternoon. Everybody else, thank you for tuning in. Have a good one.
Okay, well, thanks so much for having me.
All right.